Good afternoon, story fans. How are you all doing? So first, I know I'm not supposed to do this, but I'm going to admit that I'm a little bit nervous. But I can remember my college communications professor who used to advise us to imagine the audience naked as a way of disarming stage fright. You probably heard that too at some point, right? Well, as we get older, that doesn't have the same appeal. So I decided I would imagine a big buffalo head wearing a cowboy hat. Oh, there it is right there. All right, so it's also why I'm wearing a cowboy hat on my big head right now. So if you get nervous listening to me, just focus on the hat. It's better for you than trying to imagine me naked. Welcome to the 2023 Wimberley StoryFest. This portion of the festivities includes a portion of a program of stories about courage, family, UFOs, bootleggers, clairvoyance, divine intervention, and the vortex phenomenon. My name is Melvin E. Edwards, and if you're a man who grew up with the same first name as your dad, you know the significance of the E. If George W. Bush were here, he would tell you. When you grow up with the same name as your dad, you spend your whole life trying to distinguish yourself from him. All the juniors in town this weekend know what I'm saying. So I'm pleased to have the chance to be the master of ceremonies for this portion of StoryFest. I'm the host of a podcast that features great storytellers telling great stories every week. I'm also an author, so I'm used to telling my stories in written form, as I did in my two books. The first book is called The Eyes of Texans, From Slavery to the Texas Capitol, and they're actually right over there. The second book is The Strength of a Thousand Sons, More Stories from My Texas Family. Stories are a community's common bond. Sometimes within a family, they're the only way we're able to maintain that sense of family. That's what I learned during my extensive family research. I spent over 30 years doing genealogy research before I could write my books, because there just wasn't that much that was documented. During slavery, there were no government documents, deeds, or wills that would have been honored in any courtroom. The only way I was ever able to eventually gather the data I needed was to just hold on to the family stories I'd heard since childhood and eventually wait for technology to catch up. Having electronic records on the internet is where I was finally able to confirm, or deny, as the case may have been, many of the family stories. In my books, I trace how my first generation of Texans was brought here in the 1840s. And the stories follow a direct path of each generation that led to me becoming a speechwriter for the governor of Texas. That's the Slavery to the Texas Capitol subtitle of my book. The idea is triumphant. The reality is a little more complicated than that. There was the victory of my great-great-great-grandfather leaving slavery with a blacksmithing business that afforded him the opportunity to buy some property in the 1860s. Being a property-owning adult male allowed him to vote 100 years before the Voting Rights Act. The county voting log then allowed me, 5 generations later, to find him during my research. Without that single voting roll, which showed that he had lived in Texas since 1844, I wouldn't have known he was here until 1870. That's because 1870 was when the US Census finally began listing former enslaved Americans by their legal names. Before then, they didn't have legal names because they didn't have any legal rights. Now, that's one of the stories I can prove, and because of that, I was admitted as one of the first Black members of the Sons of the Republic of Texas. I carry around this card, it's my membership card, in honor of my great-great-great-grandfather, Isaac Blayton of Leon County, Texas. Without this single voting record, the earliest proof I had of Isaac's life in Texas was in 1870. That's a quarter century after the Republic of Texas stopped being a republic. No proof, no membership in the Sons of the Republic of Texas. If I didn't have that membership, my story wouldn't have the same impact. It wouldn't be any less real, though. It would just be less quantifiable. Now, not all the family stories I heard were as easy to prove. In fact, some were impossible. When I started my podcast this year, I decided to call it Real Life and Other Fantasies. because of a lesson I learned during my genealogy research. I discovered that there are some stories that people cling to tightly that can be proven to be false. I also learned that some of those same fantasies are the truest part of real life for some people. We cling to stories because sometimes those stories are our only connection to the past. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's why we're here today. We're going to listen to some storytellers share their tales, and I'll leave it up to them to acknowledge if those tales are tall or just mostly tall.